Good morning. This lecture is going to go over the central nervous system. At this point, you should have a good understanding of the neurons and neuroglia that make up the tissue of our nervous system, whether it be our central nervous system or our peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is going to be made up of the brain and spinal cord. So a little humor for you there. The brain and spinal cord are what we're going to be looking at and studying during these next lectures. Okay, so your brain actually looks like this on a scan. And if you notice, you can see the eye sockets coming in and going out. You can see the nose at one point. You can actually make out the mouth and the teeth that are in there. You can kind of see them as they go. The scan was actually focusing on the brain, so the other structures in the head are kind of looked over. But you definitely can see the eyeballs. And then you can see the white and gray matter. We've talked about the fact that the gray matter is going to be the neuroglia and the cell bodies, as well as the dendrites. And then we know that the white matter is where those myelinated axons connect with other neurons. All right. So pretty fascinating watching this go back and forth. Feel free to stop the video and go back and watch it again. You can see that corpus callosum, which is that C-shaped thing in the middle that connects both of our hemispheres. You can see the cerebellum at the back of the head. And when it gets right in the middle, you can see the spinal cord. It's coming into view right now as it goes down into the body. And at the top of that spinal cord is something we call the brainstem. And the brainstem is what we're going to start this lecture on. Okay, so here is a sagittal section of the head. There are a number of things here you can look at. I am going to have you specifically look at the brainstem. So the spinal cord comes up from the bottom. It's going to come up to this first part where it just widens. You can see this part right here just gets a little bit wider, and that is going to be called the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is going to be the almond-sized increase in the spinal cord as it moves into what we call the brain stem. Okay, the next section here is called the pons. The pons is the bigger bulb in the brain stem. And then right above that is something that we call the midbrain. Okay, so those are the things that we're going to be focusing on in this first half of this lecture. Okay, when we look at the whole brain, it looks a lot different, and we don't see much of the brainstem if we look at the superior view or the lateral view. It's only once we section it that we get to see that brainstem, all right? And if you look on this image here in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that the brainstem is made up of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Okay. So for the central nervous system, this is where you're going to start your notes. It is abbreviated as the CNS, and it does contain the brain and the spinal cord. All right. There will be 6 main regions that we're going to cover, and we are going to be starting with those that make up the brainstem. So the medulla oblongata again is that almond-sized increase in the spinal cord, and it controls lots of different things that we don't ever have to think about. Like when you sneeze, the medulla oblongata will constrict your vascular system. Okay, super important that we don't have some sort of loss of pressure or blowout of pressure when we sneeze. And so the medulla oblongata can help regulate that peripheral blood flow. That's the second thing on that list there. Your medulla also controls your breathing. It's the involuntary portion of your breathing. Breathing is something that can be considered voluntary or involuntary because of the fact that you can hold your breath. If I ask you to hold your breath, you can. Now, if I ask you to stop your heart from beating, well, that's a whole different story, okay? So when you're asleep and you're breathing, it's your medulla oblongata that's going to regulate that breathing. And then the first thing that I kind of skipped over was the regulation of your heart rate. Your heart is going to beat in order to meet the demands of the oxygen that needs in your body. And so it's going to regulate your heartbeat as well as your breathing, and those two things are going to go together. And again, they will be controlled by the medulla oblongata. All right. Okay, the second region of the brain that we're going to look at is going to be the pons. The pons is the bridge between the brain, or the cerebellum. I shouldn't say the brain at this point because that is what we're studying. The bridge between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain and the spinal cord. And the cerebellum is really important in order to control our coordinated movements. So the only way that the cerebellum is attached to the cerebrum is through the pons. Therefore, if you have something wrong with your pons, you will have trouble controlling your body. Okay, this is what the underside of the brain looks like. Here we can see the spinal cord here that's been cut. And then right above that, we can see the little increase in size there. That's the medulla oblongata. And then above that, you have this larger bump called the pons. All right, that larger bump called the pons, super important. Controlling the cerebellum, which is back here. Again, coordinating your movements and sending those signals through the pons up into the brain itself, okay? Now, I want you to know that sensory information that comes in from your eyes, nose, ears, what gives you balance, coordinates 600 muscles in your body. So I want you to think about times when you've had to control more than one thing. If you drive a car, that would be an example. So if you don't drive a car, maybe you started playing a video game where you have to run and jump at the same time. These are things that your cerebellum are going to help coordinate. And your eyes take in visual information, your ears take in auditory information, and your brain is going to process that and then tell your muscles what they need to do in order to perform that task. Okay, so if I go back to driving, that's something I'm very familiar with. If you're not extremely familiar with driving, that's okay, but you understand this idea that you have 2 pedals at least on the floor that you must control with your foot, right? You have to press the gas to accelerate and the brake to stop. All the while you're steering, you have to keep your eyes on the road and make sure that you know where you're going. You have to be able to judge speed and distance, and all of that is going to come through your cerebellum. When you're learning new information, it's important that you spend what am I looking for? You spend time with no distractions, right? You give your undivided attention to driving when you're learning to drive. I know that when I started driving, I couldn't listen to the radio because I had to think about what I was doing, where my feet were. You know, if I was turning, I had to use my blinker. If it's raining, you have to turn on the windshield wipers the whole time. You're looking where you're going. You're controlling your speed. You're making sure you're in the center of your lane. And so it commands attention in a lot of different areas. And it's because of our developed cerebellum that we're able to accomplish these tasks. All right, so cerebellum is directly connected to the pons. The pons is then directly connected with the rest of the brain, brainstem, spinal cord, all of that. All right. Okay, so as we're moving through this, the next section that we're going to look at and talk about is going to be the midbrain. You'll notice that the midbrain has two dots attached to it. So the midbrain is going to be this little part that's on top of what looks to be the brain stem, all right? And your midbrain is really important in your reflexes, your hearing and visual reflexes. So normally when we're in the classroom, I do the naughty thing of dropping a textbook very loudly, and usually I get more than half of the class to jerk their heads and turn real quick and look and see what has happened. And that is going to be because I activated their midbrain by creating a loud noise. That is a hearing reflex. Nobody controls looking over when they snap their head, right? Some students don't snap their head around, and then they will eventually look, and that's a different reaction, okay? So when we talk about reflexes, if you've ever had a bug almost fly in your eye and you closed it before you realized that it was a bug flying at your eye, these are the reflexes that we're talking about, and those come from the midbrain. It's called the startle response is what we get. Your midbrain also allows you to track things. Now, when I say track things, if you think about back to those video games that I know so many of you play, as something's moving away from you and you have to hit it like a precise target, it is your midbrain that's activated to track the movement of something. Now, if we go back to our driving example, you're going to track a car that's moving down the highway if you're waiting for it to pass, so that way you can make a turn. Your eyes would track that vehicle as it moves down the road, okay? So really important in tracking your hearing and visual reflexes. That is what we call the midbrain. Now, there's something that you need to focus on right here, and that is going to be something that is going to happen throughout the brain stem. So please remind yourself how many parts are part of the brain stem. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Okay, so please remember all of those are part of the brain stem. In there, there's going to be something called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. And the reticular activating system processes and takes care of thousands of impulses all at once, okay? The word reticular means net or filter. We had the reticular layer in our skin, which was a net holding everything together. So I bring that up to you because of the fact that reticular means net or filter, okay? And it's because of your RAS, you are able to filter out trivial impulses that come from your senses. So it's crazy to think about this, but when we start thinking about something that smells, so you come home, you walk in the door, and oh my gosh, you can smell mom's enchiladas, mom's cookies, mom's baking a cake. Maybe dad's the baker. Maybe it's your brother. Who knows, okay? But your reticular activating system is completely stimulated when you walk in and you smell something like that. Now, after you've been in the house for a few minutes, or after you've been smelling this for a few minutes, you don't smell it anymore. Your reticular activating system is going to filter out what it's now considering to be a trivial impulse. You smelled it, you didn't do anything about it, your brain's going to let it go. This is the same way people are able to work in like sanitation departments and so forth. When you first walk in or you first get near the sanitation station, it stinks like poo-poos and oh my gosh, it's so stinky. But after a few minutes, your brain considers it to be trivial and it will just filter it out, which is so interesting. Okay, so the reticular activating system is going to be scattered in your brainstem. And when I say scattered in your brainstem, I almost want to think about, flour in a cake. right? We know that there's flour and sugar and eggs in a cake, but when you look at a cake, you don't see that, but you know that the flour is mixed in there, right? Imagine trying to pull all the sugar out of a cake. It's not something you can do. Okay, so when I say scattered in the brainstem, we know that the reticular activating system is in the brainstem, but we don't feel like it's one specific structure. Okay, so your reticular activating system is also really important in maintaining and functioning of your consciousness. The fact that you're awake. When you go unconscious, it's because your reticular activating system has switched off. All right. So kind of crazy. If a boxer is punched and knocks out in a fight, it's because that punch caused the reticular activating system to just shut off. Night night. Now, how do you wake the reticular activating system? Well, you would think about how you get up in the morning. Do you have an alarm clock? Does the sun wake you up? Does noise in the other room wake you up? Does your mom touching you wake you up? Okay, these are things that are all going to stimulate your reticular activating system, causing your consciousness to wake up, and then you can maintain that consciousness once you're awake. So the reticular activating system is the reason why you're either a heavy sleeper or a light sleeper. And believe it or not, you can train yourself to be a heavy sleeper. All right. The people in New York that live next to traffic that's 24/7 going on, they don't hear it after a while. Their brain counts it as a trivial impulse and it sorts it out, and then you don't hear it any longer. If you've ever had a white noise maker, I know that when my kids were babies, we would play white noise, as it's called. And that just stimulates the reticular activating system to the point where your brain creates this kind of shield that all sounds are trivial, and it allows, a child to go to sleep even though there's noise going on. Okay, so really interesting, this reticular activating system. If your reticular activating system is damaged, hopefully you can come up with the word when you can't become conscious, when you're unconscious for long periods of time, right? If somebody's in a coma, it is because their reticular activating system is not working correctly, or a doctor has shut it off. If a doctor is going to place somebody in an induced coma, I believe their reticular activating system is what they control. Very, very interesting. Okay. So super cool. You guys now have learned about the three main parts that make up the brainstem. I should say the three parts that make up the brainstem. Okay. The medulla oblongata, the pons, and the brainstem. And the midbrain, making up the brainstem. I will be making other videos for the cerebellum, the diencephalon, as well as the cerebrum. So make sure to watch all of the videos.